Welcome to Transcendence Talks podcast with your host, licensed professional counselor, Kristy Crabtree. Join us as we build the bridge between psychology and spirituality and discuss psychology for the soul.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Transcendence Talks podcast. As promised, we have another amazing episode planned for you guys today with Dr. Libby. Last time she was here, we talked about ketamine, and everybody loved the information that she had to give. And we had touched on hormones in the last episode and absolutely knew we needed to do a follow-up episode because that rules our entire lives. So welcome back. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited for round two.
Me too. Oh my gosh. So I know last time you and I talked, we talked a lot about how, I know for me in my practice and in yours too, but more so in mine, I think because people are just unaware of the impact that hormones have. So I think in my practice as a mental health professional, people come in, I've got depression, my OBGYN said I have PMDD. We get adolescent female clients who are like at the onset of puberty or into puberty, and they're on birth control or have hormone imbalances. And then they have all these mental health conditions. But nobody's talking about the interplay between these hormones and mental health. And for me, I'm like, we can't separate it. I can only take you so far in your mental health journey until you go see somebody who knows what they're doing with hormones. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm so excited for this conversation.
Yes. That is, it's going to be so much fun. There definitely is a big connection. And similar to what you said, I feel oftentimes in my practice, I can only go so far without the mental health specialty on board as well. And so I love talking about this connection. And what's on your mind? Where do you want to start?
You know what you just said actually prompted something. So I want to talk about, I don't know, maybe trauma, because with trauma, when we've grown up in a house that's been, abusive, unstable, dysregulated, we're constantly in this fight flight state, which creates a lot of cortisol output, which could lead to adrenal insufficiency. And what I briefly understand, and it's outside of the scope of my practice, but what I see is with all that trauma and the instability, people tend to have adrenal insufficiency. And then I know that can wreak havoc on people's sex hormones, and create kind of this curve of anxiety and depression, right? Like high cortisol, we're anxious, and then we crash, and then we have depression. And so people come in like, I think I'm bipolar, and are just like, how about no? Let's talk about these cycles. So I don't know if you could speak to maybe more about like how this adrenal insufficiency issue, how trauma eventually leads to issues with sex hormones and all these other things, this cascade effect.
Oh yeah. I mean, that is a whole container that we can open up. And I think what comes to mind first is you're absolutely right. There's a huge connection between childhood trauma at any point in our lives and the way that that's going to affect our bodies. And I think cortisol gets a lot of the attention, as it should. Cortisol is the only hormone that we really cannot live without. We can live without estrogen. We can live without luteinizing hormone. We'll be okay, but we need cortisol to stay alive. And it plays a huge role in our mental health. We test cortisol all the time in the office. And my favorite way to test it is not just a single blood test. It's being able to look at the pattern all throughout the day, because there's a curve that cortisol is meant to follow. So in a perfect world, our cortisol curve goes hand in hand with our circadian rhythm, which goes hand in hand with the sun. And so ideally a couple hours before waking, the cortisol starts to rise and melatonin starts to decrease. Those two hormones like to dance. They both are really in the same cycle. You can even just do a quick Google search for a visual like cortisol, melatonin cycle, and you'll be able to see it pretty straightforward how they operate together. And so naturally, our melatonin should be rising at night and our cortisol should be falling. That's what allows us to stay to sleep all throughout the night. And then a couple hours before we wake, which primally would be with the sun, that cortisol rises, and it peaks about an hour or two after waking. And then it ideally gradually decreases all throughout the day. And so that's a really, really quick snapshot of the cortisol picture. And oftentimes what we see with cortisol imbalances or adrenal exhaustion or that overstimulation of being in fight or flight all the time is a couple of different things. So there can be the wired and tired picture, which is somebody is waking up with way too much cortisol and they're exhausted. And on a lab, you might be like, well, you have enough cortisol, you woke up, what's wrong? But they're outputting too much cortisol from the moment that they wake up, and it's staying high all day long. Typically it crashes at some point, and that's that person who just needs the afternoon nap, or they get home from work and they're exhausted, they can't do anything else, they don't have energy to cook dinner, but that could be all these different things. Another flip side of that is somebody who's likely already gone through that stage of adrenal exhaustion, because typically your adrenals start to get really tired, cortisol tries to keep up, and then the adrenals are overworked trying to get you to do all of the things on your to-do list, stay, whether you're raising kids, whether you have a demanding job, whether you're going through a life transition, maybe it's a lot of grief or a car accident or something that just really took a toll on your body. Eventually the adrenals can't put out that level of cortisol anymore, and that's when the crash happens. And that's typically like our stage 3, stage 4 adrenal exhaustion. And those people are usually waking up like flatlined. They have nothing really to wake them up. They're snoozing the alarm several times, and they're waking up with about this much cortisol, and they're going to bed with about a little bit less than that. And the third tier of this conversation is like the insomnia picture, and that's when the cortisol curve is actually flipped. And so those people are often waking up with nothing, and then because they have an inverse curve, maybe around 5, 6, 7 o'clock is when their cortisol starts to spike, and they don't that melatonin isn't overcoming the cortisol, and the cortisol is what's keeping them awake. And so that's more of an insomnia picture. And all of that said, that entire concept can have a lot to do with being in a fight or flight state for a really long time, chronic stress on the body, which goes hand in hand with chronic inflammation, and eventually malnourishment of the adrenals and overexhaustion of the adrenals. And that definitely is going to have a huge effect on our reproductive hormones, on the communication in our brain. So the concept of the HPA axis, that A in that concept is the adrenals. The hypothalamus and the pituitary are parts of our brain. Those are signaling areas typically. And so when that conversation gets too tired or is overstimulated or has nothing to communicate about anymore, then, we can have this lineage of symptoms, and that leads to typically in the allopathic world, very singular diagnosing and treating.
So there's probably very different treatment plans, I imagine. I mean, I'm thinking about it from this mental health side, right? We would probably see people come in, I'm exhausted all day and then I can't sleep. And then that's making me anxious and depressed. And so they're probably seeing like some cycles in their moods, irritability, things like that. Maybe they're feeling like they're too snappy at their kids. So our treatment plan would look very different. But again, without addressing the adrenals, there's not a lot that we can do besides give them some tools and maybe help them regulate their nervous system so they can start getting out of some of these patterns of fight flight. But what would that look like to help somebody get their adrenals back on track? I mean, if we're talking those later stages, how would you start working with somebody like that?
Yeah, totally. The first thing I want to mention is what you as like a therapist would bring to the table is actually a crucial part of the treatment plan. Being able to really teach and empower somebody to have the tools to regulate their nervous system, to know when they are in fight or flight, when they're overworking themselves, really creating that attunement with their body is going to be imperative to the whole picture healing process of the adrenals, because it's multifactorial and it takes time. It is not a treatment for the people who aren't willing to make changes in their life. We can do, there's a little bit of band-aids that we can do with like some strong herbs or, basic nutrition and things like that. But typically at that point, like stage 3 or stage 4, when we've had this chronic picture going on for a long time, there needs to be a lot of different diet and lifestyle changes in order to fully heal the adrenals. And so if you were to walk into our office, we likely would run comprehensive labs in general right off the bat. We wouldn't focus just on the adrenals because we want to see what the thyroid is doing, probably the reproductive organs as well, get a really good picture of a person's GI, seeing if there's, gastric inflammation, food sensitivities that could be going on, anything that might be contributing to the bigger picture on top of our low-bearing fruit. And so cortisol is one way to look at the adrenals, but there's a lot of other factors as well. And then once we got a good picture of what areas of the body are imbalanced or undernourished, then we would go about creating that treatment plan. And so let's say it was this person, it's like everything else looks actually pretty good. We really think the adrenals are the root cause here of, whether it's insomnia or the mental emotional picture or just chronic fatigue. There's this really lazy diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, whatever that means. Like, sign us all up for that, it's a lazy diagnosis. It's not looking at the root cause, and people get really attached to that because in my experience, it's because they don't have a real answer. They're like, well, I have this diagnosis and now what do I do? Well, a lot of times, again, in the allopathic world, it's an antidepressant. It's a benzo for anxiety. It's, I would say that those are the top 2 things. Maybe something for sleep. It's all of these very individualized, targeted medications to help with the symptoms because there hasn't been a proper investigation of what we're even treating. And so the adrenals specifically, typically my approach is going to be diet and lifestyle. So really, really good nutrition, healthy fats, lots of protein, really cutting out the processed sugars and foods and making sure that somebody's getting enough calories from a healthy place. And so with adrenals and hormones specifically, we actually want around 40% of those calories to come from healthy fats. Wow. And that's a very fun conversation to have, especially with women, because then we're also going to unwind a lot of belief systems about nutrition and body image. And I say healthy fats with like bold and underlined because there's obviously a difference there of what's going to be nourishing, what is going to help promote hormone regulation and balance, and really be the nourishment to heal. And then we'll likely bring in some adrenal support through a supplement because that's going to help things get moving quicker. That's going to give the person the up that they need to actually be able to make the changes that we're asking them to make. Because, if you have somebody who's flatlined or overstimulated and has been living in this state for a really long amount of time, that's all that they know. And so then to be like, well, now I want you to go to yoga and start breath work and eat healthy and show up at your job better. And, it's just too much to ask without giving them a little bit of bump, a little bit of boost. And there's a bunch of different adrenal supplements. That's something that really should be chosen by a trained practitioner because some of them are going to be more for the higher cortisol, some are going to be more for cortisol depletion. And then you want to be aware of if it has a glandular in it, if it's all herbal based, what kind of nutrients are in there that could be you want to choose the most well-rounded thing, and you can only do that if you have a well-rounded picture of what's going on. Right. And then I think the last part really with adrenal recovery is rest. It's building that attunement with your body. It's allowing your body, your adrenals, the space to really, really recover. And it just comes down to sleep. And again, what you were speaking to, how are you going to ask someone to sleep if they're anxious about it really is, it's multifactorial. And it's really important to have that holistic approach when going about adrenal health.
Yeah, I mean, when we start talking about this, it's like you could start to see the bigger picture of how one thing that starts to go wrong slowly starts to impact other systems.
Mhm.
You mentioned the sex hormones, and I've heard this, and you can confirm or deny if this is true, but I've heard that in order to conceive, you have to have sufficient adrenal health because it requires so much cortisol to go into labor and deliver a baby, and that
Mm.
the body will protect you from that event of giving birth by not conceiving if you have adrenal insufficiency. Is that true?
So yeah, I mean, well, I'm not going to say yeah straightforward because I first off want to like talk to the point that the women's body is amazing. And so to have that be a concrete yes or no
Hmm.
is really unfair because there's women who become pregnant and deliver perfectly healthy babies under some of the most stressful circumstances, under the influence of drugs when their basic needs aren't met. We can name a million things.
Mhm.
I think that this is again when individual healthcare is so important because in the same breath, it also could be a huge component to either the inability to conceive or how um, what the well, I can't think of the word right now, but I guess like what the flavor of your pregnancy is like.
Yeah.
It can definitely have an effect on that, as well as the stress response of the body. So when we talk about stress, we're also talking about basic things like blood pressure,
Mhm.
like preeclampsia, like which also goes hand in hand with protein and nutrition. Um, but I think the overarching answer to that is in a perfect world, the body does want to feel safe in order to conceive. And whether or not mom is aware of how safe or unsafe she is in her body or what kind of home she's building inside of herself for conception is really a subjective experience. Because, like I said, it can't be this objective yes or no, but to say it doesn't play a role, um, I think everybody can see all of like can
Yeah.
definitely come to different destinations with the way that the cortisol and the adrenals play a role in pregnancy and conception for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of moving the conversation back to mental health, right? So we have these issues with the adrenals, and then that influences the sex hormones. So what do we start to see change, when that happens in a woman's kind of biopsychosocial presentation?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's pretty, it can be really subjective because there's so many hormones and factors to look at. But let's just say to create a situation that everyone can probably connect to. Let's say that there's a lot of stress going on in the body. Now the cortisol is likely really spiked. There's inflammation going on. Now we can see that or we've talked about a little bit the connection with the brain, the adrenals, um, the whole body in itself, and then reproductive organs specifically. If we have a influx of cortisol or depletion of cortisol, that's going to change the way that we respond to insulin. The way that we respond to insulin is going to change our metabolism. The
Yeah.
way that our metabolism is or isn't working optimally is going to change the way that our ovaries are functioning. That's when you can get into um, something like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, or uterine fibroids, or having a bogged down liver. And in Chinese medicine, the liver governs all of the hormones and the blood and the reproductive system. Um, and then maybe now with either underlying suppression of stress, you're going to probably see the reproductive organs mimic that. And so that could be somebody with amenorrhea, somebody who doesn't have a menstrual cycle, somebody who is not ovulating. Like the root of that is likely suppression from somewhere in the body. And then that could show up as really long menstrual cycles, really short menstrual cycles, spotting, pain that we've just decided is so common that now it's normal, going through 15 pads or tampons a day, saying, oh, well, it's been like that since I was 13. And then that's, again, like an umbrella example of getting to the root cause and also simultaneously being able to see how everything is constantly in communication together.
It's like seriously, this topic blows my mind. I could geek out on this all day long. Because oh gosh, growing up in this allopathic medicine system where you walk in and you're like, hey, I'm having a heavy period and you're 13 years old and the doctor's like, well, that's not good. Let's put you on birth control. And then your cramps won't be so bad and your period won't be so heavy. And I'm sitting here thinking like, at what cost? Like, and then what, right? Because everything is communicating, and obviously it probably wasn't a hormonal issue to begin with. There's something deeper going on that we're just missing. And I guess I get really passionate about this because I know that was part of my story as a teen, and then I see, young women, teens come into our office, and we ask them about their medication history, and it's like, well, I'm on birth control. Well, why? Well, because I have these heavy periods, or because they're not regular, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, what could we be doing different? How could we serve better?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have so many questions. So I'm curious about the implications of that, right? And then I want to know, like, what's normal anyways, right?
Yeah.
What is a happy period? Like, what is a normal phase throughout a month? What should we be concerned?
Yeah. Yeah. So normal changes over time because kind of like what I mentioned, we tend to get very used to what's common. And then that becomes a new normal for a society, for a generation, for a family, for a community. And so this is a really important conversation. I also could geek out about it all day. And my unfiltered, like straightforward version is, yeah, like birth control is way overprescribed. Um, you know, it pretty much rolled out, FDA approved around like 1960, I think. And so we're just really starting to get a handle on what the complications are and the implications are of birth control and all of these different types, whether hormonal, non-hormonal, all the different factors that do play a role in the impact of birth control. So what age did you go on it? How long have you been on it? What does everything else in your life look like alongside of birth control? Because there are ways to nourish your body with the awareness that you are on birth control, because it does deplete you in a lot of ways. Not only like energetically and physically, like, or mentally, like, can it change things, but it can also physically deplete you of like your B vitamins and, zinc, magnesium, things like that. So all of that said, I definitely think it's way overprescribed. And I think the straightforward reason why is because when you're only seeing a patient for 10 to 15 minutes and they come to you and they have, acne or really heavy menstruals, or maybe they just haven't even given themselves to regulate, like they're just young and they're going through puberty, and we just get to like take a breath before we start exogenously changing their hormones. I would say that the allopathic world doesn't have a solution, and that's not necessarily on them. They don't have the time to spend testing hormones on day 3 of a bleed and day 18 to 22 of a cycle. If that woman even is having a relatively normal cycle, which is around 28 to 33 days is what I would say. I would say 29 to 30 is like optimal. And so there's all these different times during the month that we can look at hormones to really see the dance that they're doing, to really give us a good picture of the ratio of different hormones, if they're spiking when they're supposed to be, when they're coming down when they're supposed to be. There are some things that are concrete and pretty non-negotiable when we know, what a healthy cycle is meant to look like. And so then, yeah, the answer is we'll take this birth control and we're going to try out different blends and potencies and, types depending on this and that. And we're going to find something that works. And then once the symptoms get better, which some of the times they do, a lot of times they actually don't, then great, we fix the problem. And then 10 years go by. And then it's like, oh, now what? Or 5 years go by, or sometimes 6 months go by. And a woman is like, that messed me up. I feel crazy. And I just stopped it. And now what do I do? Like, I'm like, okay, here we are.
Women, it's like I've been on this since I've been 13, and now I'm married and I'd like to conceive, right? Like 15 years later, and it's like, oh shoot, what happened?
And this is like the first generation, or not I mean, these like last couple generations where we're actually seeing the implications of what long-term use of birth control is doing. And it's non-negotiably affecting fertility and conception. I mean, we could even get into the nitty-gritty of it plays a role in your pheromones. It plays a role in the partner that you choose. It plays a role in a lot of different things. And so I think initially when birth control was invented and the FDA said, yeah, sure, this is great, there was just a couple kinds, and it was primarily used for conception. And then over time it's like, oh well, it's helping with acne, it's helping with depression, it's helping with weight, and it's helping with, but is it really? No, it's not. On the outside, yeah, it might be changing things, but like what you were mentioning, like what is this actually doing? And when you think about why it's helping those things, it makes sense. And the deeper question is, what is the imbalance in the body that called for the need of birth control in the first place?
Right.
You're just masking that deeper, and you're suppressing that communication from the body deeper and deeper and deeper with the use of hormonal birth control specifically, and even non-hormonal birth control. And that, I mean, it changes a woman's intuition, it changes her connection with her body, it changes so many different things. And it actually, from a homeopathic standpoint, pushes those symptoms deeper and deeper, deeper into the body versus the way that they were coming out of the body to the point that they were communicating with us, like acne on the face or changes in your GI, or maybe you were having 10-day long bleeds, but now we don't even know what your baseline is because we're masking it again. So we don't know what your body is trying to tell us. And we're pushing that deeper and deeper and deeper inward. But on the outside, like it worked. The birth control worked. It's also like a ticking time bomb. And my last comment on that is that's why there is a whole conversation opened up about the menstrual cycle being the fifth vital sign, because it literally tells us so much about a woman and health and balance and home, like just so much. So I like to consider it like that as well. We got our blood pressure, our respiratory rate, our pulse, our oxygen, temperature, and we've got deep dive into your menstrual cycle as well, because it's that informative.
So what does it tell us? And on the other flip side of that, the suppression that can happen, right? When we kind of mask symptoms exogenously, what is that time bomb? What are the implications of that?
Yeah. Hard to say because everybody is so different. And I also think that every woman, like what she wants is different. So I also want to honor the woman, the female who goes on, like she maybe doesn't care about any of this. She's like, I'm happy to take my last row of sugar pills and I'm happy to like barely have a period and I'm feeling better and my sex life is great and my skin is clear. I'll cross that bridge when I get there. What I often see is women who were in that state, and like what you mentioned, now I'm older, or maybe my life has just changed, or I'm going down a deep dive into myself and my health and what it means to be a woman. And now, like, I'm done with this because I'm seeing all these things that I couldn't see before. And so as far as like the implications, like we don't necessarily know. It's definitely going to impact everybody differently. I work with women who like, they pull their birth control and they're like, I want to go down the fertility journey. And 3 weeks later, they're pregnant and they're like, holy shit, I thought I needed you and now I don't. I'm like, that's great too. Honestly, I don't have an answer for that. I have no clue why one woman could be on the pill for 8 years and she's actually trying to proactively prepare her body for pregnancy with this idea that it's probably going to be a journey because she's been on the pill for so long. She hasn't had a period in 5 years. And then I don't know. And then, you have someone else who has completely different experience. And that's, again, I can't stress the individual approach enough and the holistic approach enough, because that same woman who just pulled the birth control, her adrenals could be great. She could have, her thyroid could be perfect. Her nutrition could be optimal. She could be exercising, like all these, where maybe somebody who's been on on the pill for a really long time, also has a story of deep trauma, also went on the pill because she never had regular menstrual cycle from the start. Maybe she's had PCOS for 10 years and that's never been addressed because we've never had that vital sign to speak to us.
Right.
So it really, really depends when it comes to what the implications are. And I also, of course, want to note, and I hope that this would never even be a question, but like, do I think that there's a place for birth control? Of course.
Yeah.
Am I over here like, I'm not taking a stance for women? Well, no, it's literally no. It is amazing to have birth control accessible and as an option. And I just think what we're lacking so much of is the education component, because if you're going on birth control to prevent sex, for sex to prevent pregnancy, that's why you're going on the birth control pill.
Right.
But often when you're going on the birth control pill or, Manura, like all these different things, the bar in your arm, I'm not going to use all the fancy names for them, but you don't always know what the implications are, what this could mean if you're going on it, or if you were recommended it for, acne or something like that. I mean, I have a similar story. When I was 14, I was severely, severely iron deficient. And I was super anemic. And I remember going to the doctor and they would ask me like, well, how heavy are your periods? And I was always lucky to have, once I got everything into balance, like I've always had a pretty smooth menstrual cycle. So I was like, no, I'm like 4 days long. I have a couple cramps, maybe I take an ibuprofen or two and I move on with my life. And they just like the doctor could not wrap their head around, like could not find the root cause of this iron deficiency, because you do lose iron through blood. And so it's very common for women to be iron deficient, especially if you are on the heavier side of not only bleeding, but bleeding for longer days out of the month. Maybe you're getting your menstrual cycle more often than 28 days. Maybe it's coming every 3 weeks, something like that. And your body doesn't have enough time to replenish that iron. So the doctor could not figure out why, they're like, oh, well, maybe you have a GI bleed. I had a colonoscopy. I had an endoscopy. Couldn't find anything. Everything came back normal. I was like 14. Here's birth control. And on top of that, don't take the last pill. Only take that once a quarter. And so between the ages of like 14 and 21, not only was I on the birth control pill, which was hormonal, but I was prescribed to skip that last row. So I never even got like a pseudo period. I literally suppressed everything, did not bleed for like 5 or 6 years. And I didn't know any different. I was like, well, I'm iron deficient. And I was a runner my whole life. I ran all the way through college, and you need iron and hemoglobin to be able to do, anything basic, let alone compete. And so, and train and things like that. Women with iron deficiency, often it's like exhausting going up and down stairs. It's exhausting walking on a treadmill. Like can be very, very depleting and really, really hard to just get through a normal day. And so when I was young and when I didn't know, the implications that I've touched on a little bit, I was like, well, this is all more important to me. And I also was like, this is great. Like, yeah. I was like, I just never have to buy tampons again. I never have to like awesome. Sure. And then, it wasn't until I was in college and I was on the team and competing and everything like that. And I caught wind about how being on the pill with the hormonal pill can have an impact on like bone density and stress fractures. Mm-hmm. And I did a lot of my own research, and just a basic keynote of that is it has to do with estrogen. Estrogen has a lot to do with like bone density and health in general. And so that was actually my wake up call. I was like, well, shit, I was on this because I wanted to run, and now I want to get off of this because I don't want to get injured. I don't want to get hurt. And so, that's a little bit of my story. And I went off of it cold turkey. And I think at that time too, I was probably 20 or 21. And so I did have more awareness around who I was as a woman, what it meant to be a woman. I was, caring a lot more about things like that come with that maturity. And I also did have a shift in myself, in what was important to me, how I felt. And I was like, oh, there's something to this. And then, fast forward another 7 or 8 years and I'm finishing med school. And I was like, wow, what a journey it's been. Here we are talking about all of this on such a deep level.
Absolutely. So we're talking about, normal menstrual cycles. You kind of mentioned, 28 to kind of that 32-day range is optimal. But what about bleeding, right? What is a heavy period? How many, you mentioned, you've always had this 4-day bleed. That sounds phenomenal. I've never been so lucky. But, what's a healthy, normal range for a period?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Chinese medicine, which does have a different lens than Western medicine and even naturopathic medicine at times, even though we dance really closely together, would say like 3 to 4 days of bleeding. Very, very, very minimal, like cramping, but also like a little bit of, you need like a little bit of something, something, like a little bit of some symptoms is actually normal. And I always remind my women of that too, of like, and we'll get into that as well, the seasons and the character of the menstrual cycle. And so again, this vital sign of ours, it changes every single day. And so it's totally okay to have a couple of those symptoms. Like you should know, oh, I must be getting close. Maybe your energy changes, maybe your breasts change, maybe your skin changes, maybe your cravings change. I think the keynote of that is to what extent? Like,
Yes.
what kind of a pendulum swing are we having? Is it pretty digestible? It's pretty manageable. It's consistent. Or is it like every month I am just like swinging all the way this way? And then this is happening that month. And then this month I had 4 boxes of cookies. And, like, I think that actually, I'd love to mention just the benefit of tracking your cycle. Like if you're not tracking your cycle, get an app, use the iPhone app, use a pen and paper, something, just basic tracking of like, how did I feel a couple days before? How long did I bleed for? Am I using tampons, pads, a menstrual cup? Am I free bleeding? What did it look like? What was the color? Was there clotting? Was anything extra abnormal this month? Just like a basic diary
Right.
of what's happening so that you can gather that data and then you can look over it the course 3 months, 6 months, a year. I actually was on my app today and I've been tracking mine since 2018. I don't know where that time went, but I'm like, I have a lot of data. I have a lot of information and I don't get too like invested in it where it's like every day, oh my gosh, like my right ankle was hurting and I lost a little bit more hair in the shower, like something must be wrong. Like we don't want to become obsessive.
Right.
But circling back to that main question, and what is normal, I do think everybody has their own normal. And what it would look like is 3 to 4 days.
Yeah.
I would say if you're using typically those like first couple days for some women are a little heavier. Typically, actually, what I'll say is women know which like 1 or 2 days are heavier. They're significantly different. And then they typically know like what their symptoms are. And so when it comes to how much blood, I hear anything from 2 tampons a day to 15 to 20.
Wow.
I would say for hygiene purposes, if you're using tampons, if you're using pads, changing every, 3 to 6 hours is healthy. How full is that is typically something that we would dive into. It's pretty hard to measure if you're not using a menstrual cup. Some women, they can straightforward say, on my heaviest day, I fill up my cup 4 times. That to me is like, that's on the heavier side. That's a lot of bleeding. And then, the next question is, well, how many days are you bleeding this heavy for? And so essentially, no matter what, we want to shed the uterine lining. We want to detox everything. This is like our most natural, beautiful detox that we're privileged to have every single month. We want to honor that. We want that to go through its full cycle. But that's where like the conversation of hormones, diet, nutrition, exercise can all come into play when it comes to a heavier menstrual, a lighter menstrual, and then of course mental emotional health as well.
Wow. So when you're talking about like suppression issues, right? So if we're skipping those sugar pills and we're missing the bleed, it sounds like we're missing some important detox benefits as women.
Huge. It's never happening. There was a doctor that I worked with a few years ago, and every once in a while, so he did a lot of like hormone replacement therapy, like biological, and I learned quite a bit from him. Specifically with men, this is a little bit of a tangent, but when he was working with testosterone, your hematocrit will get higher with higher testosterone levels. So the viscosity of your blood, kind of like how thick and sticky it is. And the solution to that is donating blood. And this always stuck with me because these men would be like, I have to like go and okay, first of all, donating blood's amazing. If you're able to donate blood, please go donate blood. Um, it's very, very underestimated how often blood is needed in emergency situations. And so that's just a pin. But on top of it, we'd have these men, I have to go sit in line and they're going to like, I'm a faint or like whatever happened. I don't know. They're kind of being big babies about it. And he would be like, do you know that a woman gets to have this detox benefit like every single month? A woman gets to detox blood that is going to promote new blood, new platelets to form, having that fresh circulation, literally cleaning out the blood. We want clean blood. I could go on another tangent about like ozone therapy and stuff like that and the benefits of like the way that blood can actually become like boggy and full of toxins. And it, again, a Chinese medicine approach has to do with like how much blood do you have, how clean is it working for you, or is it working against you? And I always loved that because he would compare it to like it's your menstrual cycle, like go donate blood, like go facilitate that natural detox for yourself, because it's just going to kind of like throw a wrench in the body and give it something to focus on, and to only promote like a little like cleanliness, like purifying. Not that there's anything like dirty about, and I don't want that to be misheard. There's nothing dirty about the blood. It's just really more of like getting to shed everything, getting to detox, letting the body create again, getting that new, like helping out with the immune system, all sorts of things. My brain's going in like 10 different directions because I could talk about so much when it comes to this. But
what a gift, what a beautiful perspective that I feel like, as women, as mothers to girls, we don't get that perspective. We don't get to hear about, the benefits, the gift of that opportunity to literally release every single month. And I don't just think about it as the physical detox release. As you're talking, my mind's like, and how do we honor that part of our cycle and sit with ourselves, right? When we're maybe a little bit more tired, a little bit more run down, feeling kind of bogged down and heavy, and focus on emotionally, what do I have the opportunity to release this month?
Absolutely.
What do I want to let go of?
Mm-hmm. And that, I mean, brings me to such a beautiful conversation, which is for the entire history of humans, women's cycles are, again, primally synced with the moon.
Yes.
And it's not by mistake. And if you deep dive into astrology or shallow dive into astrology, like the basic parts of an astrological moon cycle is setting intentions for the new moon, calling in what you want to create, what you're committing to, what you want this next cycle to look like, this next 30 days to look like throughout all of the different phases. That's typically when, the world is like the darkest at that time. There's no moonlight in the sky. It's a new moon. Even our physical sky is dark.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it's a full moon, that is like the release. That's the letting go. That's the, okay, I'm looking back on this last 30 days and I'm getting ready to go into the dark side again, into this new moon again. And so there are some really good conversations to be had about a women's cycle syncing with the moon. So there's old concepts and new concepts about like a white moon and a red moon. And are you ovulating during a full moon or a new moon? Maybe you're not even in sync in that way with the moon, but you can look at it on the same cycle, which is essentially like 4 basic stages with a lot in between. So you can break up your month into a quarter. And you can also do this with the full year. And so I really like to bring the seasons into it as well. So we have summer, fall, winter, and spring. And so when you look inside, when you're bleeding, that's typically the winter. That goes hand in hand with, again, encourage everyone listening to just begin to track their cycle. I often see too that once you start tracking it, things start to shift. Once you start putting that intention into like, oh, where am I at this point in the month? And do I know how many days I'm bleeding? And do I know when I'm ovulating? And maybe how my mucus changes, or how I feel differently energetically, what I'm signing up for, what I'm saying no to. Once you start to become more attuned to these little bits and pieces, which could happen quickly, could take a year or two. I have no idea. Your cycle, it's almost like, hey, like you're paying attention, you're listening. Sometimes people literally regulate because of that, because of the intention. And so circling back to the seasons, that inner winter is when you're bleeding. That's when you're going inward. I mean, we live in Arizona, so we don't really get the benefit of being able to look outside and be super in tune with the seasons. But I did live in the Midwest for 23 years of my life. And so I can speak to winter. I can speak to negative 20-degree days and blizzards and the sun going down at 4 p.m. and really that cocoon season, that season where like you just don't plan a lot and you light a fire in your basement and you make warm soups and nourishing like classic Midwest casseroles that are very hearty and comforting, and the sun physically goes down and the days are darker and shorter and things like that. That's our bleed. That's our inner winter. And then that happens for, let's say that season is 5 to 7 days. Whether or not you're bleeding that long, that's going to be subjective. But then you start to go into your spring, which is going to be your follicular era. And so that's the time in between bleeding and ovulation. And that's when, just like spring, we plant seeds. We are coming off of this, maybe a new moon, maybe a full moon, whatever, our bleeding moon. And we're like, okay, I'm going into my personal cycle. I just released everything. I just detoxed. I just let it all go. I just cocooned. Maybe I was emotional. Maybe I broke up with my boyfriend for a day and I was in love with him 3 days later and it was complicated. And here we are, like all the things that can happen. And now typically in that spring season, it's like, ooh, maybe you're in the mood to do a little like thrift shopping. You're like, I just need a little spunk in my closet. I want to actually like plant some seeds. I'm feeling creative. I'm feeling a little bit more energized. Maybe exercise changes. Like I'm feeling into a little jog or like a faster paced yoga class or something that's more social. Just throwing out examples here. And that's all in preparation for ovulation. And so we go through our inner spring, our springtime, and that's going to be the cycle inside of our own body is now building up and preparing for conception. Conception can only really occur around our 4 to 6 spicy days around ovulation. And this is if a woman's ovulating, which can be assessed through like lab work and stuff. We can see if we're getting the spike of hormones. So FSH, LH, everything should be raising estrogen and progesterone. Those are kind of the 4 main ones that we want to see that spike around ovulation. And ovulation is our summer. Ovulation is spicy. It's hot. It's expressive. I actually was giggling to myself because I reached out to you last week and I was like, Kristy, I literally just started bleeding today and I can't show up for shit. Right. And I was laughing at the first podcast because I was ovulating. I was like, I was spicy. I was heated. I was passionate. Like the energy really came through. And now here I am, about a week after. And I felt so lucky that I just got to honor my cycle. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to speak to that a little bit because, I feel very much in my springtime right now. Like I'm social, I'm grounded. I'm kind of coming back alive after bleeding and cocooning. And you can start to taste the ovulation a little bit. You're like, oh yeah, okay. This energy is coming back and I'm getting ready to create. I'm getting ready to say yes to social events. I'm okay boosting my schedule a little bit, taking on a little bit more. Even this weekend, which is when actually I will be, I'm going to like 3 or 4 networking events. I'm like, absolutely, that feels great. Yeah. And that only comes with being in tune with my cycle, where I'm able to, I have, again, the privilege of being able to organize my schedule to the best of my ability to support my natural cycle.
Right.
Don't get me wrong. There's going to be times when I'm bleeding and cramping and I have a huge breakout and like you got to show up, you know.
Yes.
That could look like the that could look like a lot of different things. I also think it's important to have that conversation with yourself. You know, that can only come again from developing that relationship with yourself. And so, yeah, ovulation is that summertime, it's that expression. And then after, so I'll just speak to this from more of a medicine perspective too. For a lot of women who don't know, ovulation, again, like I said, we have the small period of when, period, no pun intended, the small era, you know, when it's about usually 7 days ish after bleeding, day 14, where we can conceive. And so all the hormones are spiking, they're all ready for conception. And in a balanced hormonal world, on top of, I do think emotions and mental health play a huge role in this as well. The right partner can play a role and sometimes has nothing to do with it. But that is when conception can occur. And what's going to happen the next couple of days after that, let's say sperm meets egg, embryo, okay, now we're going to implant to the wall of the uterus. This is the part where progesterone is so important, is these couple days after, let's say in theory, conception happens, that embryo, that conceived embryo can stay implanted to the uterine wall all on its own. But after like 4-ish days, mom's body is going to be asked to do that. And that's what we need progesterone for. So progesterone is going to be the key hormone that takes over that implantation process so that the pregnancy can continue on, the placenta can be created, the connection between mom and baby can be like firmly established. And so for a lot of women, if progesterone isn't investigated during these crucial days, like during this part of the cycle, then that could be the root cause of, let's say, infertility, which I don't even like using that word. I think it's, again, a lazy word.
So broad, right? It's so broad.
It's ridiculous. They're like, okay, you tried for 1 year and now you're in, like, oh my gosh, give me a break. Don't even get me started on the rabbit hole of like money and big pharma and all that stuff. But yeah, so that needs to happen. And again, I ask a lot of women, well, when was your progesterone tested, if it even was tested? I would say 50% of the time it's never even been investigated. The other 50% of the time they're like, oh, I have no idea where I was in my cycle. And I'm like, oh, well, do you track your cycle? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay, let's start here, because this is crucial. Like, it's really important to know when you are ovulating if you're actively trying to conceive. And I think a lot of us were really scared and brainwashed as young children in our health classes that, oh my gosh, like you could just get pregnant at any time. So like, watch out. It's like, no, can we? Like, no, that's just not biologically true. And that could even be a whole conversation for another podcast too. So let's just clear the water there. You cannot get pregnant anytime in your month. And you also can or can't get pregnant without really knowing your cycle, because if you don't know your cycle and you're sexually active when you're ovulating, but you don't know that you're ovulating, then it might be like, oops, didn't know that could have happened, but it did. Like, I'm one of the unlucky ones. Like, actually, no, if you weren't wanting pregnancy, actually, no, you just didn't know that you were ovulating and you were sexually active. And so a lot of people are really afraid of the concept of natural birth control, but it's very, very effective if these conversations can exist prior. And so when that, okay, let me just circle back here to finish up our seasons. When that progesterone is spiking, that's what we call, that's going to be happening during the luteal phase. And so that's kind of like our autumn. That's our fall time. And what I really like about that is if conception does occur, progesterone, estrogen, the ratios are healthy, mom's body takes over, then pregnancy continues on and goes forward. That's a whole nother journey. If that doesn't happen, whether or not you're even trying to get pregnant, like maybe like that's not the conversation. The whole point is that your body is ideally going through the cycle regardless. And so then in the luteal phase, in our fall phase, that's kind of the time when we, exactly what it sounds like in the season of like the leaves change, things start to fall, things prepare for winter. Our emotions start to change quite a bit. And that's, we can circle back to this, but the conversation that you kind of brought up about what is PMS, what is PMDD,
That's
are
a,
these,
yeah,
yeah,
that's
because
exactly where I wanted to go, because I'm like, oh my goodness, as you start talking about fall, I'm thinking about how the women I see in my practice, my supervisees who come in and they're just like, to help me, I have to help my client because she's like feeling 80% better 3 weeks out of the month. But this one particular week, like we are seeing regression in her mental health. She's losing it. She feels out of control.
yeah,
So yeah, that fall luteal phases feels like such a critical time to help women understand themselves and how to manage this.
it is. It is. I love that you said that, like help women understand themselves, because it's like, it's a blessing and a curse with all of these like conversations that are flying around all the time, because I think often a woman in that season who does have a maybe more intense luteal phase, she just like wants an answer. She's like, so do I have depression or not? Do I need to be medicated or not? Am I crazy or not? Why, like, do I love my boyfriend or not? Like, I'm just like, she just wants an answer. And so from a physiological standpoint, yes, it is important to look at your labs, like look at the facts on the paper. Are there any imbalances? Are there any ways that we can support with this from a functional medicine standpoint? And I think from the therapy point of view, being able to recognize like, oh, this is her fall time. This is when she's getting prepared. Like, can, again, primarily from a body standpoint, the body didn't conceive, and so now it's getting ready to shed. It's getting ready to go into that inner winter, go into that darker side, go into that cocoon so that it can shed and start again. And I think that what's really cool, like what I mentioned, when a woman does become more in tune with her cycle, whether it's through journaling or opening up conversations with the therapist, intention setting, things like that, you can use that roughly 3 to 4 week cycle to facilitate these conversations for you. So like, what did we talk about when you were coming out of your winter and you were feeling more energetic and you were feeling more stable, more grounded, maybe less reactive, less stressed? This is all just in theory because everyone is so different. And part of getting synced up with your cycle is just knowing your cycle. And so, some women, they have actually really, really low ovulation periods. They experience more depression during that ovulation period. It's really just, it's different for everyone. And I think having that basic groundwork is what's so important. And then as we open up these conversations, you kind of watch how the body just naturally changes and adapts, and it feels seen. Like, I genuinely think that. Yeah, like, it especially if you do come from a story where there has been these band-aids and suppression and shame or fear around, like, well, it was my responsibility not to get pregnant, so that's why I went on birth control, and now I'm like confused because I thought I was honoring my body, but I was actually, I don't know, maybe honoring the patriarchy. I was going to put that out there. And now I actually really want to honor my body, and I want to be in a healthy relationship with a man or with a woman who honors my cycle and has reverence for my cycle. And you're having all of these like ideas and concepts and awakenings. And so figuring out whatever that foundation is for you is like step number one, and knowing where your body is currently operating at. And that's when you can start to get curious and ask questions. So maybe in the case that you mentioned, that week before the menstrual is the toughest, it's the heaviest, it's the most aggravating. Well, that's a great conversation to open up, because the body's getting ready to release. And so what is the body trying to tell you it wants to have a conversation about, or it wants you to feel, or it just wants you to set the intention and physically like let it go with your bleed? There's a lot of truth to that.
Oh my gosh. Okay, let's dig in here, because I've always had this hunch too. And I actually, at my phase of life, as I'm into my 40s now, and I'm working with a lot of women, that are in their late 40s, early 50s, approaching menopause. I almost feel like there's some similarities between menopause. It's almost like a grander scale of like this autumn phase, but with women in any point of their life cycle or hormonal cycle, I always had the hunch intuitively too that it feels like, what is it that maybe emotionally you're suppressing? Because it feels like PMS, PMDD is exacerbated. It's almost like the body is like, hey, you can push this down when you're ovulating. You can push this down as your period's winding down, but you can't ignore it. You cannot ignore it. I will no longer allow you to suppress these emotions during this phase, and it will exacerbate those symptoms. And what's so interesting is, when I get to meet clients during these seasons of their monthly cycle, um, whatever they bring up is so relevant to whatever it is that they're trying to heal. And it feels like this opportunity to express things that maybe they could mask emotionally during other phases of their cycle. And so I tend to look at those things as intimately connected. And I see it as really important, especially in relationship work, right? Like when they're kind of pointing at, well, my husband drives me crazy, when I'm PMSing, and, we're okay, like during other times of my cycle. And it's kind of like, are you, right? Or are you better able to mask those things? And so it does. Autumn feels like, for me as a therapist, like a time to really dig deep and get so honest with ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a perfect time to do that, because if you think about the season of the year, which we also just broke down in the scheme of a year, and then also in the scheme of a month as a woman, you theoretically are looking back on these like last two seasons, and how did the seeds that I planted show up? Did they grow? Were they nourished? Was I catering to them? Um, it's kind of like that time of, yeah, deep reflection and retrospection of the intentions that you set, or what you did with more of that spring energy and more of that summer energy. What did you choose to create? What did you choose to um, invest in, or look, blah, 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 blah. And then how is that serving you now? How is that showing up for you now? Is there anything that no longer resonates? Is there something that you're like, I've been doing this for years and I actually like do not want to do it anymore? And maybe that's the first time in your life that you take a stance for yourself. Maybe that's the first time in your life that you open up a conversation that you've, like exactly what you said, it comes up for 5 days or 7 days, and it's definitely at the forefront of your awareness, because women are wildly intuitive creatures. And so you start listening to that a little bit more. And then if it continues to be ignored and suppressed, you're going to go through this cycle of winter. And then here we are in spring again. Let's do it again. And I bet as a therapist, you can find bigger and deeper cycles in ways that that's been showing up in someone's life. Like it maybe is so much more than a little conversation that she's been wanting to have with her husband or something like that. Like it's likely, oh, but every time you get close, you quiet up, like you quiet your voice. Or every time that you get close to making this change, you actually ignore it by coping with something else. Or every time that you're just about to do this, the anxiety creeps in and you end up, drinking too much. I don't know. I'm just coming up with different concepts of ways that you can see these cycles that can show up, and the way that this vital sign, our menstrual cycle, can be such an indicator of that. And it's really a chance to tune into your own authenticity, your own relationship with yourself, all of the different ways that our body communicates with us. Sometimes it is through physical symptoms, and most of the time it can be, but also thought processes, also the mental health as well. Brain fog and anxiety and depression and all of these different things that have these fancy names. Don't get me wrong, some of them are real and they're valid. But can we ask? Yeah, exactly. And can we just ask better questions before medicating and being like, okay, we'll follow up in 3 months when you need more or something like that. Because I
Yeah.
think that that's a lot of, like, it seems like you see the population in between me and allopathic medicine. The
Yeah.
people who are like in between, they're like, well, I'm working on my mental health and and I'm trying to like do this healing, but I'm also been put in a box because of what my symptoms are, and now I'm being medicated for that. And while there's a healthy place for medication, do not hear me wrong, there is a healthy place for medication. Medication in itself is typically suppressing.
Yeah.
It is targeting symptoms, and it is going to specifically alter whether it's neurotransmitters or different receptors in the body, hormones, very, very, in a very targeted way, which
Yeah.
really complicates the communication with that medication and the rest of the body.
Well, and you would think suppression, not just on a biological level, but then on an emotional level. I'm still here at fall. I'm still thinking about, the irritability of PMS, because anger has a gift, right? And it usually propels us towards change. Maybe anger or irritability allows us to finally use our voice and say that hard thing. Maybe compels us to have that difficult conversation. I know it did for me. I've been married for close to 20 years. So every marriage has ups and downs. And while I'm grateful to have a beautiful marriage, during some of the harder times when our kids were little and we were learning to parent and we were learning to share responsibilities and we were stressed out and not making a lot of money because, I was in finishing grad school or not making any money as an intern, whatever, right? These life stressors. It was funny because whenever I would bring up a hard conversation with my husband, oh, this is what we had to work through. And I remember she would look at me and go, babe, why don't you check your calendar? I bet you're just really close to your cycle starting. And I would say, thanks for acknowledging that. That's probably true. And this is real. And we need to have this conversation and we're going to have it now. And this is just giving me the strength to communicate these things that I'm able to overlook during the other times of the week, of the month, right? But I can't overlook it this week because usually the anger, the irritability doesn't come up. And it's not that driver for me to have these hard conversations, but it's those hard conversations. It's taking those emotional risks with your partner. That's how we heal through things. That's how we allow ourselves to be witnessed and seen and to let things go or to gear up to let things go.
Absolutely. And they're coming up for a reason. Like, that's not, I think a lot of times women they get so hard on themselves and like, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? It's like, okay, again, let's ask a better question. Nothing is wrong with you. And I love what you brought up about your partner recognizing that. And that goes hand in hand with step one, get in tune with your own cycle. And then assess your life. Like, are you with a partner that you can share that with? Because that educational piece is twofold. I know, like, I could speak to that a lot. And I think too, getting in tune with your own cycle, like kind of what I spoke on a little earlier too, it really might change what you see in your outside life. So let's just say you do look at your partner and you decide, okay, like, I'm feeling these things, I'm opening up about these things, I'm having the conversations. Whether or not you're meant to continue life with that partner or not is going to be part of your experience. In general, at some point that's going to come up in life. But let's just say, like in your situation, you've been married for 20 years. You guys have built a beautiful family. You have amazing kiddos and dogs and careers and all sorts of things. And I love that acknowledgement of like, why are we pretending that this is just going to be like rainbows and butterflies the whole time? And what could be possible if not only I was in tune with my cycle, but I got to share that with my partner? Then nobody feels attacked. Nobody feels threatened. Nobody has to get defensive. Both of you can be on the same page of like, oh, this is the time of the month that I'm in right now. And this checks out. This makes sense. And I think that there's so much like gray area and ickiness around that conversation because of the reputation that a woman's bleed / menopause has. And for the longest time, I mean, especially growing up as kids, like, we get to change the narrative about what this means. Like, I think we need to be calling our men forward that, hey, you need to be educated about this.
Yes.
Or hey, I am not crazy. My bleed is not disgusting. Like, I am not untouchable. Like, I what are we talking about? We got to mature a little bit, like as a collective, and teach not only like younger girls what the beauty and the reverence for the cycle really can be, but also like young boys. This is really, really important conversation to be having. And I think you and we talked about it like over lunch or subtly, but like, if you don't know, the reason that a hysterectomy is called a hysterectomy is because it was a cure to a women's hysteria back in the day. Like, we have so much deep conditioning around a woman's cycle and her seasons and the power that she has, as well as delicacy and the fragileness. And let's not forget the fact, the ability to bear life. And like, hello, why is that like normal? Like, we should be in awe of that every single day. And to be able to enroll your partner in that conversation is so, so beautiful. If that is something that if every partnership could share, like, our world would be a different place.
Absolutely.
And it also, in my experience, same to what you were speaking to, being able to honor like that irritability or the anger, or maybe those just more charged conversations that want to be had. There's also an opportunity for a woman to step into her sacred rage a little bit and not have to have it all together all the time, not have to look pretty all the time and be perfect and whatever, but actually just get to like let it out in a safe environment with her partner, which gives, in a heterosexual relationship, it gives the man the safety to soften into his feminine a little bit and hold her in that, which there's nothing more beautiful than being able to sync up that dance together. And that is not a punch to a man's masculinity or his manlyhood or whatever any of these like power terms are. It's really just like, whoa, we all carry both energies. We all carry the feminine, we all carry the masculine. And when you can reflect that based on your cycle, it opens up so much opportunity for depth and transparency and connection and trust to be had, and for those deeper conversations to exist. And I know like sometimes like those conversations, it's not always like we're going to talk about this like huge transformational thing in our relationship. Sometimes it's like, you know what? 4 years ago, I saw that text on your phone and I made up a story in my head about it. And I never said anything because I was too put together and too mature to ever say anything about it. And now I know it's petty and I know I'm being a diva, but I have to bring it up. And then you just set the story straight, or like whatever it is, and I just totally came up like out of thin air with that. But like, it doesn't need to be this big, like, are we going to have kids or not? Or like, should we quit our jobs or not? Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is like the petty stuff that deserves to be voiced, because somewhere, if it wasn't voiced, don't underestimate the power of those things to compile and to create stories, and to, the way that those stories can kind of run our subconscious is very real. And it's so important to give those. I mean, if you haven't listened to part 1, we talked a lot about the parts. Part 1 of the podcast, parts with internal family systems. Those pieces and parts of us want to be heard. And when we can open up those conversations with our partner while being in sync with our cycle, like, that is a secret ingredient. It's really magical.
Gosh, I love what you said too. It feels like this fall is also just giving ourselves permission to be in our humanness, to be in our feminine, to receive, and just to fall apart a little bit, like for us to be nurtured and to be able to receive nurturing. And I can see how even that might be a battle for somebody who maybe doesn't know how to receive because of a trauma response and feels like they have to just have it together all the time. I can see how this luteal phase would really like bump up against them and really create some friction, because they're constantly fighting and not surrendering to this beautiful part of their cycle where when you know how to use it as a tool, right, it can help you. But if you're not surrendering to that part of the cycle and you're fighting to keep it together and to maybe have the same level of performance that you would during other parts of your cycle where you have a little bit more energy and your hormones are a little bit lower, it can be a real challenge. And so there's so much for us to become aware of within ourselves when we can just have these conversations about our cycle. But what I'm wondering is, some women walk into my office and they've gotten a diagnosis of PMDD. I do see that go hand in hand with trauma more often than not. But I'm wondering, is there something biologically we should be aware of? Or I even see people get medicated, like, I only take my antidepressant the week leading up to my bleed. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. And for some people, it saves lives. But other times I'm wondering, again, what are we suppressing emotionally and biologically? So anyways, that's a ton of questions. Yeah. But that diagnosis is very elusive for a lot of practitioners.
Yes. Yeah. And that diagnosis in itself, it's very broad too, which I think is fascinating. And so, anyone could just look up PMDD, DSM-5 or something like that. You'll see the criteria and you're going to probably diagnose yourself. You're going to be like, oh shit, I didn't know I had this. Because there's a lot of symptoms that are suggestive to the diagnosis, and it doesn't take much to get the diagnosis or to be given, or like however you want to word that. I want to say the only difference that makes it separate from PMS, which is syndrome, which is just a culmination of symptoms, is that like really intense mental emotional component. Mm-hmm. And so PMS is going to be more of like, how many of these symptoms do you have? To what extent, no one really talks about. What do you really do about PMS? You just kind of put yourself in a box. You're like, well, my periods suck and I feel like shit and like I have PMS. Well, there's so much that we can do to support PMS and lessen the burden of those symptoms and get to the root cause. And I would say the same is true with PMDD. And so I think like the first step is addressing and being able to distinguish, are there significant emotional, like traumatic events in your life? Is that the root cause? Mm-hmm. Maybe yes, maybe no. Is the anxiety, depression, really aggressive mood swings, things like that, coming from something current in your life now that you're not listening to? That's when we can really work with our cycle. I think no matter what, we can really work with our cycle and open up those conversations with ourselves based on the different seasons that we're in. It would be really fascinating to like build an approach that was heavily focused on cycle syncing to see how warranted maybe in 6 months or a year that 1 week of medication was needed, what would be the byproduct of more women getting in touch with their cycle and listening to the symptoms, and then being more educated on how to nourish those symptoms. And so that can come from nutrition in itself, the way that you do cook, the way that you exercise, the way that you communicate with yourself, the way that you schedule and plan your month out or your week out. I'm curious what nourishing from that holistic lens would do to that quote diagnosis.
I'm curious too. And I also feel like there has to be a desire to look, right?
No matter what.
There's got to be a desire to look. I mean, if you're kind of like, ooh, I have all these emotions and this makes me so uncomfortable, and like all I want to do is like medicate it away and I want to hide. And like, it just feels like with, I guess, healing period, right? Like healing in general requires an openness, a willingness, a softness, and a surrender. It's like when we just protect and we hang on so fiercely, it feels like that exacerbates that uncomfortable feeling. That's the fight. Yeah. And that creates more of the concern or the perpetuating issues. But it's kind of in that surrender or that willingness to like, okay, let me bravely explore what is coming up that feels so difficult during this time for me.
For sure.
To get to the bottom of that. So I think women, depending on their readiness to heal, their readiness to get to know themselves, is probably going to change the outcomes or even the way that they choose to approach their cycle.
Right. I would definitely think that would be true. And I'm like hypothesizing this because it would be, I don't have enough of a population with the women that you work with all these dynamics that we've been talking about. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I also would love to speak to the physiological part too. So,
Mhm.
when it comes to like hormonal regulations and everything that we've kind of touched on, there can be like some very straightforward imbalances, inadequacies, places of malnourishment that are going to contribute to different symptoms throughout the cycle. So, a couple of those could be like the ratio of estrogen to progesterone. The ratio is really, really important, especially during that luteal phase. So, when I run labs, there's benefit when we're going more down the fertility journey.
Yeah.
We'll run some on day 3, progesterone, especially day 18. We can't do any of this unless a woman knows when her cycle is. Otherwise, we're just taking a stab in the dark. Um, and then also looking at mental emotional health. It's very, very helpful to see what progesterone and estrogen are doing during that luteal phase, because while we could have this progesterone spike or we could not at all,
Mhm.
same conversation essentially, it's going to change the balance of estrogen and progesterone, and we want that to be in a pretty tight ratio. We want them to dance pretty closely together, not number wise together, but when it comes to the ratio. And so, maybe you've heard of the concept of like estrogen dominance.
Yeah.
Estrogen dominance is exactly what it sounds like. It's a dominant amount of estrogen in comparison to progesterone. And that estrogen dominance can really affect not only the whole cycle of a woman, but definitely that luteal phase.
Mhm.
That can really contribute to lower mood, to weight gain, to cravings, more the depressive picture, acne, all sorts of things. Same breath as progesterone, not enough progesterone, not getting that spike, essentially the same picture can happen. And so we can definitely go in and target those hormones pretty directly if we know what information we're working with. That's
Yeah.
something, when we talk about herbs like Vitex or DIM or DHEA or, those are some of like the stronger common ones. There's a place for ECGC, which is a constituent of green tea. There's, chamomile. There's all sorts of beautiful herbs and natural ways to support those hormones, but we don't want to rock the boat if we don't know what boat we're rocking.
Right? Yeah.
So there's definitely an element like that's part of the conversation as well, is really actually like what's going on inside of the body and can we support it? We talked about iron deficiency a little bit. That is very real. Like if someone is having a heavier bleed, maybe that's how it's been her whole life, and now let's say it's been more normal or she's on birth control now or something like that that's changed the cycle. If she was severely iron deficient or just even a little bit iron deficient and never had enough iron to replenish from those heavy bleeds, it's pretty hard to get a lot of iron through the diet. It's definitely possible to maintain iron levels with just diet alone, but if you're super super depleted and then on top of that you're bleeding every month, it's hard to get enough to overcompensate the depletion and the bleed. So there's usually a place for a little bit of supplementation or a lot of education around and iron deficiency can be the root of chronic fatigue, of depression, of anxiety, of hair loss, of um, lots of different things.
Right.
And then the other one I'd love to talk on is vitamin D. And so
Yeah.
um, obviously very good for the immune system, for a very antiviral, important. We get it from the sun, blah, 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 blah. We know all the basic things, but vitamin D we need enough of because it's a precursor to all of our hormones. And so, again, if anyone wants a visual, you can type in like female hormone cascade vitamin D, something like that.
Mhm.
Google will show you that cholesterol and vitamin D are the two precursors to pregnenolone. And then that's going to go through the whole cascade, turning into DHEA, progesterone, eventually estrogen, 3 different types of estrogen, testosterone, and then cortisol in there too, which wraps around back to the adrenals. And
Right.
so I've definitely seen vitamin D deficiency, even in Arizona, where everyone's like, how the heck could I be vitamin D deficient? I'm talking low numbers of vitamin D,
Yeah.
be the root cause of not only hormonal imbalance, but like depression in itself, of mood in itself. Vitamin D is involved in like hundreds and hundreds of pathways in the body. And it's a magical vitamin that we want to be in, from a functional medicine standpoint, we would say for women around like 70s would be like a really nice number. The whoever decides what normal labs are, I don't know who they are the last time that they've talked about it, but whoever sat around the table and decided that this is normal, they have a pretty wide range. It's like from 30 or 35 upwards into like the hundreds is what's considered like normal. That's not normal in this. And I'll speak to that with iron too. Ferritin's our storage version of iron. And the range for that is super broad. I don't even remember. It's like 15 or 20, probably because I never even look at it because so many women are literally low in iron. And they call that normal. Like a ferritin of like 18 is still considered normal. And I'm like, this woman, I don't know how she's like dressing her kids in the morning. I don't know how this has been her normal for so long, and you correct those iron levels, that can go hand in hand with menorrhagia, with heavy bleeding. Sometimes heavy bleeding is a cause of low iron, and sometimes low iron is a cause of heavy bleeding.
Oh, wow.
So again, part of this holistic picture, we just support that when we have a really broad idea of what's going on. And that it can be really simple tweaks that can make a big difference. And so that was a really long version circling back to like the PMDD talk. What really is going on? That was more of the physiological approach of it could be something as simple as your ferritin levels, your vitamin D levels, how well are estrogen and progesterone, are they thriving? Are they stealing from each other? Is one dominating another? Where can we bring in some balance? I love working with herbs. Herbs are super smart. They love harmonization. Herbs are really gentle. They're really natural. And it's amazing what they can do when we're addressing some of these imbalances in the body and mental and emotionally too.
Yeah.
So,
Gosh, this conversation, just going to speak from the heart, it makes me emotional. I'm feeling really emotional right now. And it's because I think I see so many women present with so much shame. I think as women, the expectations that we place on ourselves, the obligations we feel towards our role in the home and outside the home and all these different places, like we're spread so thin. And then I feel like the systems that are supposed to be supporting us are so often failing us because we're not having these conversations. And so many women struggle and they're suffering when it could be as simple as vitamin D, as simple as an iron supplement or not, right? But I mean, I feel like if they had a team, right, of a good naturopathic doctor, a good licensed professional to be able to help them walk through their emotions and like really take a broad look at what's going on, they can see such substantial shifts. And so many people wouldn't have to suffer. So many women, right, like wouldn't have to feel the kind of pressure or shame that they put on themselves as a result of some of these things. Because for so many women, it takes so long to get to this point of suffering because it does feel so normal. And they don't realize that there's an imbalance going on until they're so depleted and so desperate, right? When it could have been taken care of years ago.
Definitely.
So I just have so much compassion, right? For people and for women. And I don't know, this conversation I hope it reaches the people that it needs to reach so that they can find some hope, because this cycle can be debilitating, right? I mean, being stuck in this cycle of depletion and expectations can be absolutely debilitating.
For sure. And when you say that, it makes me think of this cycle, the one that you were referencing, and then tying that into the menstrual cycle and everything like I shared about iron. Let's just say like that cycle in general, you're iron deficient and you don't know it. And now you bled and you detoxed and you shed, and there's never been enough iron to come in and replenish. You might not even get to like enjoy the true nature of your cycle because you're actually exhausted all the time, but you've been deemed whatever chronic fatigue syndrome because a doctor only looked at your iron and never looked at your TIBC, never looked at your ferritin, never looked at your vitamin B12 or your folate and all the other parts that are, maybe like you're vegetarian and that just got overlooked. And you don't know that there's a heme and a non-heme form of iron, and one is going to be more abundant in plants and one comes from meat and plant sources. No, animal sources, also plant sources. And so that's just something where it's like, it's not your fault.
No.
That's where the educational component comes in. And that's where, there gets to be a calling forward of some of the way that we're practicing medicine. And in my opinion, it's like, who are you to see a 16-year-old with, you're listening to her menstrual cycle and this and that, and you're not going to do anything but give her birth control
or antidepressants?
Like, exactly. Like, maybe that's just not the population that you should be working with then, is my opinion, because that is like negligence.
I agree.
There's so much more that we can be doing. There are so many conversations we can be. There's so much time that some people, like naturopaths, want to spend with their patients because they're actually interested in the root cause and in holistic health and things like that. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to be in an ER room when somebody just arrived in an ambulance from a car. Like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I just think it's important to get really clear on like, okay, why are we not having these conversations? The amount of women that they get their eyes rolled from OBGYNs when they say that they're working with a naturopath is like very frustrating. Like, they don't feel heard. They don't feel cared for. They feel like they're being treated differently. I'm not there to witness it. I don't know. I'm also not here to separate myself from all of the other different forms of medicine. I just think that there's a place to have more honest conversations about what is going on. And I'll also acknowledge that in more of the allopathic world, first of all, there's certain things like they don't know what they don't know, especially when it comes to nutrition and herbs and a lot of things that we have been talking about. And also they're heavily controlled from insurance companies, and that's not their fault. The fact that I often will give patients labs that I am recommending to see if their PCP will run any of them to get covered by insurance. I have no problem doing that. And one that they're like, I literally can't, is vitamin D, unless you have like an active reason to run vitamin D, which my understanding, and I'd love to, like, my understanding is that's if you have like osteoporosis or a history of like severe vitamin D deficiency, because insurance literally won't cover it. And I'm like, why? That's not the doctor's fault.
Right.
It's like insurance won't cover it. And I'm like, why? It is like a $50 test or a $40 test or something like that. Sometimes it's like even cheaper than that. I'm like, why are we not running this? This is such a crucial thing to know, and it can be the root cause of so much. Please make this make sense.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
And so I just, like, it's not always the doctor's fault. I actually know several people in the more the allopathic world, and like they get frustrated.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of nurse practitioners who are gaining more experience and expertise in functional medicine. And there's some frustration there as well, because they're not able to practice like what they want to, because it can be really governed from the system. And that's, I mean, there's really no one to blame there. I think it's just more about acknowledgement and being able to have like a healthy conversation where practitioners and other healthcare workers and this integrative team that we're talking about don't get like defensive and egoic about it. It's like, it's about the patient, and it's about like, we're always learning every day. We are not at the dead end of medicine by any means. Like doctors, physicians, therapists, anyone, like, we're learning every single day. And I think the best thing that we can do is share what we know and help as many people as we can. And hopefully eventually there is advocacy for more change, and we are starting to see it happen. But the one thing for sure is it's not shame on the patient. It's like they're rattling their brain too. Like, I'm getting referred to this person, and I have this person on my team, and I'm seeing a neurologist, and I'm seeing an endocrinologist, and this person told me that, and that person told me this. And I'm like, okay, like, let's just start over. I know that that's not what you want to hear, but like, sometimes like that's what it takes.
So when should, I guess I want to speak to other therapists who might be listening to this, right? When should a therapist take a step back and say, you know what, I think you would really benefit from working with a naturopath, from taking a deeper look at your hormones?
Mm, that's a really good question. I think it has a lot to do with like what is your relationship with the patient and what do you know about their story. And I think we spoke a lot today about what a naturopath can offer. And like if you are feeling like you're at this dead end road or like it's something is just not making sense, like they're not responding, I think on the last podcast we spoke to SSRIs a little bit. They're like only proven to be 50% effective. One of the main side effects is suicide ideation. Like if we want to look at deeper things that could be going on, such as like the reproductive hormones, the adrenal picture, the iron picture, the thyroid picture, all of that is a good reason to maybe suggest that. Or I would say from a therapist point of view, like building a team, a small team, and that's how you and I met. I was like, I want to build a team because I am not an expert in mental health. I really enjoy mental health and I work with it a lot and I have my approach, but there's definitely times when my approach maybe isn't targeting or isn't serving what that patient needs.
Sure.
And maybe that is more talk therapy or EMDR. I'm not trained in EMDR. I love EMDR, and there's times when I get that little like pin where I'm like, oh, I think this patient would do really, really well with this integrative approach. That doesn't mean that I hand the patient off to you and I'm like, bye, good luck, never see you again. It's building that small team where you can count on whatever that integrative team looks like to be able to support the patient the best way that's possible.
Yes. And I think as women, we need that. I think we need to advocate to build this team of nurturing women for ourselves. I know for me, after I had my boys, after each pregnancy, I went into my pregnancies really depleted. And so I came out even more depleted. And it took a team of healers, right? It took some really strong self advocacy for me to say, okay, something's not right. I don't feel well. My energy's low. I feel depressed, and I didn't want to go the allopathic route. I didn't want to be on a medication, but it was like, okay, I need a naturopath on my team. I need a chiropractor on my team.
Yes.
I need massage on my team, and probably a lactation consultant. That really helps
Yes.
you. But I needed a team, and I knew that. And so I think sometimes, we look for change out of these states of like desperation where it's like, oh gosh, I'm kind of hitting this rock bottom and I can't function well anymore. But I hope for our listeners today, they're hearing some of these things and maybe seeing themselves and thinking to themselves, maybe now's the time before I let it get to stage 3 or 4, before I continue to suppress these things and they just continue to build. So that's my hope.
Me too. And I think like what you said, it takes a team. Like I think about that, like raising kids, right? Like it takes a village to raise, and that doesn't really change as we get older. Like we all as women we're so much better together and in numbers. And whether you're raising kids, whether you're on your own journey, whether you're going through a breakup, whether all these different transitions that we go through in life, to be seen and to be held and to be acknowledged, because hey, I know my cycle and you know your cycle, so we can have that conversation. That's going to go so far. We briefly touched on that with your own partner, maybe that's living in your home, but then the broader scale of that is like your life team. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're best friends with your chiropractor. Like your team of this conversation is probably different than who you're going to happy hour with. That's totally fine. But I know like when I look at the team that I've been building, not only do I have amazing colleagues here in the Valley that I am so apt to refer to or to get advice from, being really, really able to recognize where my place is, because even though someone might be seeking naturopathic care, there really could be a better match out there. Somebody who does things different than me, somebody who has different tools or different trainings, really niched out differently. And so that's really important. And then on top of that, it's okay. I do have a prenatal and postnatal chiropractor that I can call. I have midwives in the area that I can refer to, that I will refer to. I have not only like preterm and labor doulas, but I have postpartum doulas. That one in particular, like we made a really cool connection and network, and she was like, I'm here for like the 6 month after. I am like the post-labor and delivery doula. That's her niche. That's what she does. And she works with lactation. She works with the mental emotional effect or impacts and everything. Helps out with the parenting, if there's two parents in the picture, if there's just one, like all of those things that maybe moms aren't prepared for.
Yeah.
And, like I mentioned, in the situation, the relationship that you and I have, it's really that therapy with the naturopathic. And that's a really, really beautiful dance because, I think we did a really good job speaking to all of the ways that those are intertwined.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily this or that.
It all works together, right?
It does. And there's no one size fits all, Maybe I've had patients that have worked with me for 6 months and I'm like, now I think I've taken you this far. And the EMDR with the internal family systems is going to be like the next level.
Yeah.
Kind of like what you said, I can only take them so far, but like if we don't address the estrogen dominance, if we don't address the PCOS, if we don't address the gut health, how can we balance serotonin if we don't address the gut health or the autoimmune disease, the gut health, when over 80% of serotonin is made in the gut? Like, how is that going to work?
Right. Oh, I know. You literally cannot tease out. I mean, the mental impacts the biological and vice versa. And they, in my mind, I mean, they're inseparable. They work together.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think too, like as a practitioner, as a provider, sometimes I think we want to be able to like do it all for our patients because you can kind of see that bigger picture. It's like, oh, I just want to help you. I can see it for you. And I think that it's really important and valuable when we are experts in our field to an extent because we can't burn out. Like I cannot keep up with everything cardiovascular, endocrinology, men's health, women's health, peds. No, I'm not signing up for that. I have enough information because of, 5 years of medical school where I have the basics for all of these different categories. And I have outlets of who to refer to or who to get advice from, things like that. But to try to do it all for the patient is also not the answer. I think that just leads to burnout and us wanting it more for the patient than they want for themselves. And it's like, it feels good, at least in my experience, to be really good at what I do and then have a team that I feel really good about.
Same.
And I can trust you with any of my patients. You can trust me. It's not competitive. I know that they're in good hands if I refer to you, and I know that I'm the role that I'm playing, and I'm going to do that really, really well. And you can do that without doing what allopathic medicine did, which was really, really pendulum swing, to like, this is what I do. It's just a formula. When I see these symptoms, my ICD-10 code is this, my prescription is this.
Right.
And it's interesting because like in a surgery setting, we want our surgeons to be really, really good at what they do. We want them to be experts, We don't want an eye surgeon doing open heart surgery. And so they have a team, right? And it's the middle area where I think there's a lot of confusion and lack of understanding and things like that.
The chronic care, right? Like the chronic healthcare versus
exactly
is where we struggle. But I feel like we need to have another follow-up conversation. I'm like, oh my gosh, we didn't get into like serotonin and menopause and all these things.
The seed cycling.
The seed cycling. But I think we have another conversation for another day.
Let's do it.
Dr. Libby, thank you so much for being on and for this amazing conversation today. And I think this conversation is to be continued again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all your deep dive questions and for having me and for trusting me to be part of this container with you.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, listeners. We will see you soon.